The stagecoach rattled down the last stretch of dry, sun-cracked road, its wooden wheels moaning like tired bones. Clara Bennett clutched the worn leather strap above her seat as the coach lurched through a rut, sending her bonnet askew. Dust rose in amber clouds outside the small window, curling into the air like ghosts from a dying fire. The driver's whip cracked once, twice, and the horses snorted in protest, their manes tossing sunlight as they charged toward the outline of Silver Creek. Clara had imagined this place for weeks on the long journey west, a quiet town, perhaps modest but proper, where she could teach children their letters and start a new chapter far from the polished parlors of Boston. But as the coach crested the hill and the settlement came into view, her breath caught. Silver Creek wasn't what she'd pictured. It was smaller, rougher, more alive. A handful of buildings huddled along a main street baked under the unrelenting sun, with men in wide hats leaning against railings and dust drifting like fog through the air. It looked like the very edge of the world. When the coach drew closer, Clara saw the blacksmith's forge glowing like an open wound, the saloon doors swinging lazily, and a row of wagons lined up outside a general store. A dog barked, sharp and defensive. Children, barefoot and dust-streaked, paused their play to stare. Every sound seemed louder here. The horses' hooves, the squeal of a sign in the wind, even the dull thud of her own pulse. She felt a shiver run down her spine, half from the heat, half from the watchful eyes that followed the coach's arrival. The passengers around her, a freckled woman with a sleeping baby, a trader with his hat pulled low, seemed unmoved. But Clara's heart beat fast. She'd never been so far from everything she knew. The coach came to a halt before the stage stop, a small wooden platform with a crooked sign that read, Silver Creek Depot in peeling paint. The driver shouted, "End of the line," and swung down, boots hitting the earth with a puff of dust. Clara hesitated. The moment she stepped outside, she would be part of this world, a world that didn't know her name, her purpose, or the reason she'd left home so suddenly. She smoothed her gloves, squared her shoulders, and reminded herself that she was here to teach, nothing more. The West, she'd been told, was full of opportunity for those brave enough to take it. So she opened the door and descended the iron step, her shoes sinking slightly into the dirt road. Heat struck her like a wave. The sun above was a merciless white coin, hanging in a sky too large to comprehend. Her skirts gathered dust immediately, and the faint scent of horses, leather, and smoke filled her nose. Around her, voices rose and fell, greetings, laughter, a few muttered comments she couldn't make out. She tried not to notice the stares. A woman traveling alone was rare enough. One dressed in Eastern fashion was bound to draw attention. Her dark blue dress, neat and pressed that morning, already seemed out of place among the denim and worn leather. She could feel the town measuring her, weighing her, every look saying, "She won't last a week." Then she saw him. He stood across the street, just beyond the shade of a hitching post, one hand resting on his belt where a brass star caught the sunlight. The badge was dull from wear, but it gleamed all the same. The sheriff, tall, broad-shouldered, his stance relaxed but alert. His hat shadowed most of his face, yet she could sense his eyes on her, steady and unreadable. Something about the way he watched, not with suspicion, not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet assessment, made her pulse stutter. Clara looked away quickly, pretending to adjust her bonnet, but the image of him lingered. Sun-touched skin, the line of his jaw, the hint of tiredness that clung to his shoulders. He looked like a man who'd seen more than he cared to remember. The depot manager, a portly fellow with a red face, approached her. "You must be Miss Bennett," he said, glancing at a note pinned to his clipboard. "Schoolteacher, eh? Mrs. Hale at the boarding house has got your room ready. Not much, but it's quiet." "Thank you," Clara managed, her voice softer than she intended. He pointed down the street toward a narrow lane beside the church. "Sheriff will see you settled in proper." "Luke Carson," he added with a nod toward the man still standing in the sun. "Good man to know." Clara followed the gesture, and once again her gaze found the sheriff. This time he lifted his head slightly as if he'd known she'd look back. Their eyes met across the dusty street. The moment stretched longer than it should have, a beat of stillness amid the clatter of wagons and chatter of townsfolk. There was no smile, no greeting, only that calm, measuring gaze that seemed to reach right through her. She felt suddenly foolish for staring and quickly busied herself with her carpet bag. But something inside her, some small, fragile thing that had been locked away since she left Boston, stirred. The sheriff crossed the street, boots crunching over gravel. Up close he seemed even taller, his presence filling the space between them without effort. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice low and even, touched with a drawl that carried both warmth and warning. "Welcome to Silver Creek." "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied, trying to meet his gaze but finding it almost too much. His eyes were gray, though not cold but sharp, the kind that missed nothing. He tipped his hat. "We don't get many new folks from so far east. Hope the trip wasn't too hard." "It was long," she admitted. For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, life went on. The hammering at the forge, the laughter spilling from the saloon. Yet Clara had the oddest sense that everything else had fallen away. There was only the heat, the dust, and this man who seemed to belong to the land as surely as the mountains on the horizon. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning toward the lane. "Boarding house is just that way. I'll walk you there." She wanted to protest. She wasn't a woman who needed escorting. But something in his tone, calm and unyielding, made argument seem out of place. She nodded instead, lifting her bag. "That's very kind of you." As they began down the street, Clara caught the whisper of onlookers fading behind them. The sheriff walked at her pace, silent, his hand resting easily near his holster. Every few steps she dared a glance upward, wondering what he thought of her. The strange woman who'd arrived on a cloud of dust and nerves. He said little, but when the wind caught her bonnet ribbon and she reached to fix it, she thought she saw the faintest smile ghost across his lips. By the time they reached the boarding house, Clara's unease had softened into something else. Not comfort, exactly, but the sense that she might in time belong here. The sheriff tipped his hat again before leaving her at the door. "Town's rough around the edges," he said quietly, "but you'll find good hearts here, Miss Bennett. Don't let the dust fool you." And as he walked away into the glare of the afternoon sun, she realized she'd been holding her breath. Clara stepped through the narrow doorway of the boarding house, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her careful footsteps as though protesting her intrusion into this foreign world. The air inside was cooler, tinged with the faint aroma of soap, flour, and the lingering smoke of a fireplace that had burned all morning. The room she'd been shown was modest but orderly. A small bed with a patchwork quilt, a wash basin in the corner, and a window that looked out onto the dusty street she had just crossed. She set down her carpetbag with a soft thud, smoothing the fabric of her skirt as she surveyed her surroundings. Everything felt smaller than she expected, more intimate. And yet the shadows in the corners and the faint groan of the building as it settled gave her the unmistakable impression that even the walls had stories to tell. Stories of hardship, of laughter, of fleeting sorrow and stubborn hope. Clara tried to steady her racing heart. This room, this town, was to be her new beginning, yet it felt precarious, as though one wrong step could undo everything she had worked to build. She unpacked methodically, arranging her books and teaching materials in neat stacks along the small desk by the window. The quiet, deliberate motions of preparing for her first day allowed her mind to wander, replaying the moment on the street when she had first seen him, Sheriff Luke Carson. She couldn't explain why the memory lingered so persistently. The sharp gray of his eyes, the calm steadiness of his voice, the way he seemed so entirely at home in the dust and heat of Silver Creek. There was an undeniable tension in that first glance, an unspoken understanding that both fascinated and unnerved her. She had faced classrooms full of restless children before, and even stern principals and questioning parents, but never a man who seemed simultaneously protective, watchful, and slightly challenging. That one measured gaze haunted her more than she cared to admit. By mid-morning, curiosity and necessity drew her out into the town proper. Children tumbled across the street from the general store, their bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust with each eager step. Their laughter rang high and unrestrained, but there was a wariness in their eyes that reminded her she was not in Boston anymore. One small boy, no older than 8, stopped in the middle of the street holding a battered leather ball against his chest. "Are you the new teacher?" he asked, voice half question, half command, the kind of boldness only a child raised in frontier dust could wield. Clara knelt to meet him at eye level, smiling gently despite the knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. "Yes, I am. My name is Clara Bennett." The boy's lips parted in a grin that revealed a missing tooth. "I'm Tommy. You'll see me at school tomorrow." "I'm in Mrs. Hale's class too." The small encounter eased some of Clara's tension, though only slightly. She walked further down the street, nodding politely to the few adults she passed, men leaning on fences and women balancing baskets of laundry or firewood. Their glances were quick, appraising, sometimes warm, sometimes skeptical, all reminding her that she was an outsider, a newcomer whose presence must somehow earn its place in the fragile ecosystem of Silver Creek. She reminded herself to move slowly, to observe, to listen. The children were easier. They were curious, eager for guidance and attention. Yet even among them, she sensed a guardedness that spoke of a town hardened by weather, lawlessness, and the constant uncertainty of survival. As she approached the small schoolhouse at the edge of town, the familiar sound of hooves drew her attention. There, walking across the street with deliberate steps, was Sheriff Luke Carson. He had arrived quietly, unnoticed by most, yet Clara felt her pulse quicken the moment she saw him. He carried himself with an ease that made it clear he was at home in this place. The dust on his boots, the worn leather of his gun belt, the subtle tension in his shoulders all bespoke experience, authority, and the weight of responsibility. When his eyes found hers, there was a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the shared awareness from their first encounter. Clara's cheeks warmed despite the morning sun, and she hastened her pace, pretending to study the schoolhouse door, though she could not quite tear her gaze from him. The sheriff fell into step on the street across from her, just far enough to avoid the appearance of following her, yet close enough to be unmistakable. His presence was simultaneously reassuring and intimidating, and Clara realized with a pang that she had underestimated how aware he was of everything in his town, including her. She adjusted her posture, lifted her chin, and reminded herself of the purpose that had brought her here. The classroom, the children, the chance to build something meaningful in this rugged place. And yet, with every step, there was an undeniable tension building. A silent promise that this man, whose eyes measured more than mere appearances, would figure into her life in ways she could not yet comprehend. Arriving at the schoolhouse, she paused at the door, smoothing her skirt and inhaling the mixture of chalk dust, dry wood, and lingering heat from the sun-soaked street. Inside, the desks were arranged in neat rows, the blackboard spotless and the small room filled with sunlight streaming through the high windows. Clara set her bag down, letting herself take a deep breath. This was the beginning of something new, fragile, and frightening. Yet she felt a tiny spark of hope stir within her chest, and through the window, catching a glimpse of the street beyond, she saw him again. Sheriff Carson tipping his hat to a passerby, but with his eyes unmistakably tracking her. The realization struck her that Silver Creek was more than just a place to survive. It was a town alive with possibility, and this man, with all his silent, measured intensity, was part of the pulse she had just begun to enter. The morning passed with the shuffle of children entering, greetings exchanged in murmurs and whispers, and Clara moving through introductions, attempting to calm her own nerves while establishing a sense of authority and kindness. Every now and then, her gaze drifted to the window, searching for the figure of the sheriff who had left the boarding house minutes before. He did not appear directly in her line of sight, yet she felt the weight of that quiet presence, as though the town itself had conspired to place him near enough to remind her she was not entirely alone, nor entirely untethered. By the time the last child left for lunch, Clara allowed herself to sink into a chair at her desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap, trying to calm the rapid beat of her heart. The street outside seemed emptier now, but her mind remained restless, filled with fragments of morning encounters, fleeting smiles the dust kicked up by passing hooves, and the silent, steady presence of Sheriff Luke Carson etched into the edges of her thoughts. She understood then that the tension she felt was not just the anxiety of a newcomer, but something deeper, the unspoken pull of a man whose strength and quiet authority were woven into the very fabric of the town. And though she would not admit it aloud, nor allow her heart to acknowledge it fully, she felt the beginnings of a connection that would shape her days, her fears, and her hopes in Silver Creek in ways she could scarcely imagine. The afternoon sun slanted across the schoolhouse floor, casting long, golden streaks between the desks, and Clara could feel the heat through her dress, even as the windows offered a faint breeze. She had just dismissed the younger children, when a sudden clatter at the door startled her, followed by a rough chorus of voices from the older boys. Clara turned sharply, heart pounding, and found herself facing a small band of teenagers, their clothes dusty, boots scuffed, and expressions mischievous in a way that carried the unmistakable tone of frontier audacity. We don't usually have new teachers here, the tallest one drawled, leaning against the doorframe with the casual defiance of someone who had been master of this street for years. Clara's pulse jumped. The challenge in their tone was clear, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Do you belong here? Can you command respect in a place like Silver Creek? Clara straightened her spine, drawing in a slow, steadying breath. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk as she met the boy's gaze. I do belong here, she said firmly, her voice carrying across the quiet classroom, and I expect everyone in this room to treat each other, and me, with respect. Her words sounded louder than she had intended, perhaps even sharp to her own ears, but she did not back down. There was a pause, a charged silence broken only by the scrape of boots on wood and the distant bark of a dog outside. The boy's lips quirked almost a smirk, but there was no true rebellion in his stance. He nodded once, the barest acknowledgement that he would test her, yes, but not outright defy her. Clara exhaled slowly, trying to rein in the thrill of fear and excitement that coursed through her. Here, in this raw, untamed town, she was beginning to find herself tested in ways Boston had never demanded. Just as she began to regain her composure, a voice called from the street outside, low, deliberate, and carrying that same weight she had noticed earlier. Everything all right in there, Miss Bennett? Clara froze, her gaze snapping toward the window. There, framed in the sunlight, stood Sheriff Luke Carson, his hat pulled low over his brow, shadowing the intensity in his gray eyes. The children, sensing the authority behind his presence, fell silent, their whispers fading into a cautious hush. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of relief, apprehension, and something more elusive, the subtle awareness of being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood both the danger and the heart beneath her tentative courage. Thank you, Sheriff, Clara called back, forcing a calmness she did not fully feel. Her voice carried across the small yard outside, steady despite the rush of blood in her ears. He nodded once, a brief measured motion that conveyed approval without indulgence, and then he turned, walking back down the street with long, confident strides that spoke of experience and command. Clara sank into her chair for a moment, letting herself breathe again, but the memory of his gaze lingered, filling the room as much as the sunlight did. It was as though his presence had left an invisible imprint, an unspoken promise that the town, with all its trials and uncertainties, would not swallow her entirely. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and initial lessons, Clara moving between desks, learning names, engaging the temperaments of her students. There were children with quick smiles and quick tempers, some eager to impress, others wary and withdrawn. Each required a careful balance of patience, firmness, and encouragement, a delicate dance she had mastered in Boston, but now needed to adapt to the rough edges of frontier life. Every so often she would glance toward the window, half expecting to see the sheriff still watching. And though he was gone from sight, she could not shake the lingering awareness of him, the certainty that he had noticed her, assessed her, and perhaps even considered the delicate danger of this place for a woman alone. By late afternoon, Clara was beginning to feel the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. She gathered her papers and books, stacking them neatly as she prepared to close the classroom for the day. A soft knock at the door made her start, and she looked up to see the tall boy from earlier standing awkwardly in the doorway. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he said, scratching the back of his neck. His eyes were honest now, no trace of the earlier challenge. Clara smiled gently, the tension easing from her chest. I know, she replied, keeping her voice light but steady. I just need everyone to understand that respect is part of living together, whether in a classroom or on this street outside. He nodded once, then retreated, leaving Clara with the quiet satisfaction that she had begun to establish her presence, her authority, and her place in Silver Creek, however tenuous it might still feel. She stepped outside into the fading heat, brushing dust from her skirts and adjusting her gloves. The street was quieter now, the children having dispersed to their homes, the merchants beginning to close their doors, and the townsfolk returning to their routines. And there he was again, Sheriff Carson leaning against the hitching post of his office, watching yet not intruding. There was a subtle tension in the way he observed her, as though measuring her strength and resilience, and Clara felt an unexpected flutter of nerves and anticipation. She straightened her posture, holding her head high despite the flush creeping across her cheeks. she could feel in that moment. The delicate balance between danger and desire, uncertainty and connection, that seemed to define both the town and the man who now occupied a quiet but undeniable space in her thoughts. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, Clara made her way back toward the boarding house. She could feel the heat lingering on her skin, the dust in her hair, and the faint ache in her arms from a day of constant movement and attention. Yet underneath it all there was a pulse of something new, a sense that she was beginning to belong, even if only slightly, to this rough and unpredictable world. And somewhere in the interplay of shadow and light, across the dusty street and through the veil of uncertainty, she knew Sheriff Luke Carson was a part of that world too, a presence she could not ignore, whose eyes had already begun to shape the contours of her days, her fears, and perhaps even her heart. By the time she reached the boarding house, Clara felt a curious mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The trials of the first day had tested her resolve, but she had survived them. She had faced the children, the townsfolk, and the subtle scrutiny of the sheriff, and she had not faltered. And yet as she closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, she could not banish the thought of those gray, unwavering eyes. Something unspoken had passed between them, a quiet tension and a fragile spark that promised complications, challenges, and perhaps in time, something far more profound than either of them yet realized. The following morning dawned hot and bright, the kind of sunlight that seemed to scorch the earth itself, reflecting off the dry streets and the wooden facades of Silver Creek's modest buildings. Clara rose early, as she always did, a mixture of nerves and determination driving her from the small bed in the boarding house. Today, she would take the children on their first outdoor reading lesson, a small experiment she hoped would bring both delight and discipline to the unruly pupils. She dressed quickly, adjusting her blouse and skirts with meticulous care, though the thought of the sun beating down and the dust of the street invading every seam of her clothing made her stomach tighten with unease. By the time she stepped outside, the town was already stirring. Merchants opening shop, the blacksmith hammering at glowing iron, and the occasional horse-drawn wagon rattling over the uneven road. Clara drew in a deep breath of the dry, pungent air, steadying herself for the day. As she walked toward the schoolhouse to gather her students, she noticed a small crowd forming near the edge of the street, hushed voices and anxious gestures carrying over the heat. Something had drawn the townsfolk together, an unusual occurrence in a place where life was usually dictated by routine rather than spectacle. Clara's heart beat faster as she moved closer, curiosity and dread mixing in equal measure. Pushing through the gathering, she saw the source of the commotion. A pair of men arguing loudly, voices rising above the ambient noise of the town, their hands twitching near the revolvers at their hips. The tension in the air was immediate, palpable, a dangerous crack in the fragile veneer of daily life. Clara froze, her mind racing. She had been warned to respect the law and the unpredictability of frontier tempers, but she had never imagined witnessing a confrontation so raw and immediate. Her gaze instinctively searched for the one person who could impose order. And there he was, Sheriff Luke Carson, moving with a calm authority that seemed to part the chaos around him. His stride was deliberate, measured, boots striking the street with purpose and his eyes fixed on the men with a mixture of command and caution. Clara felt a jolt of relief, tinged with admiration, and perhaps something more dangerous. A fascination she had not yet acknowledged, a stirring of awareness that this man, who carried both danger and protection in equal measure, was becoming an unavoidable presence in her life. As the sheriff approached, the arguing men paused, tension coiling like a spring ready to snap, and Clara could see the faintest edge of respect and then fear under their stance. "Now, boys," Luke Carson said, his voice low but carrying, cutting through the rising heat and clamor. "Enough of this nonsense. You'll settle this in the proper place, not in the middle of my street." He took a step forward, hand brushing near the holster at his hip, a silent reminder of the authority he wielded without having to draw. The men glared, their anger still evident, but something in the sheriff's presence shifted the balance. One muttered under his breath and they reluctantly moved apart, the tension dissipating like fog in the morning sun. Clara exhaled, a shiver running through her, both from relief and from the undeniable thrill that came from witnessing a man who was clearly as formidable as he was composed. Her relief, however, was short-lived. A sudden shout from behind startled her, and she turned just in time to see a small boy from her class chasing a wayward goat stumble and fall into the path of an oncoming wagon. Time seemed to slow as Clara screamed, lunging forward in a desperate attempt to pull him to safety. But the wagon was too close, its driver struggling to slow the heavy wheels. Her hands barely brushed the boy's arm when a firm, strong grip seized her own, pulling her back against a solid chest. Heart hammering, she looked up into the gray eyes she had come to recognize, filled with focus, intensity, and a hint of something she could not name. Luke Carson had stepped between her and danger, shifting the boy out of harm's way in a single, fluid motion that spoke of reflexes honed by countless days on this unforgiving frontier. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice low, a touch strained as if even the sheriff could feel the weight of the moment. "Step back. You're not meant to be in the path of that." Clara's knees trembled as she realized how close she had come to disaster, and the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, steadying her, sent a ripple through her chest she could not fully control. I'm fine," she stammered, though her voice lacked conviction. She felt exposed, both by the near accident and by the undeniable awareness that she was in the presence of a man whose skill and power could overshadow her entirely. Luke's gaze softened slightly, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed. "You need to be careful here. This town doesn't forgive mistakes the way Boston might," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Clara swallowed, nodding, aware of the flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She glanced down at the boy, who was now wide-eyed but unharmed, and then back at the sheriff. Something unspoken passed between them in that brief, charged moment, a recognition that life on the frontier demanded both vigilance and courage, and that they were in some strange way bound together by circumstance and proximity. As the immediate danger passed, the townsfolk resumed their activities, murmuring quietly among themselves, but Clara could not shake the sensation of being watched, protected, and measured all at once. She felt her pulse gradually slow, though the adrenaline still lingered, and she became acutely aware of Luke Carson's presence beside her. The air between them seemed to vibrate with tension, a combination of professional respect, unspoken warning, and something far more intimate, though neither dared name it yet. For Clara, the event crystallized the precariousness of her position in Silver Creek, the children she would teach, the town she sought to belong to, and the man whose gaze now held more power over her thoughts than she could admit. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty street, Clara had escorted her students back home, her own arms aching from the day's exertions, but her spirit strengthened. She had confronted the unpredictability of this new life, witnessed the raw danger of the frontier, and survived, thanks in no small part to the man who seemed to move through this world with unshakable authority. And yet, beneath the relief and burgeoning confidence, a subtle current of something more potent flowed. The awareness that Luke Carson's presence, his calm command, and his unwavering gaze had left a mark on her heart that she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. As Clara finally reached the boarding house and shut the door behind her, the shadows lengthening across the floorboards, she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. The day had tested her courage, patience, and composure, and she had emerged with a deeper understanding of the world she had chosen to inhabit. And in the recesses of her thoughts, she felt the stirring of a connection that was as fragile as it was undeniable. A tension, a pull, and a promise that the days ahead would demand not only resilience, but also an openness to the unexpected ways the heart could be drawn to another. The morning light spilled over Silver Creek like molten gold, painting the streets in soft warmth, though Clara could feel the weight of yesterday's trials lingering in her bones. She moved with a newfound confidence, carrying her books to the schoolhouse with a measured grace she hadn't possessed when she first arrived. The townsfolk watched with cautious respect, no longer seeing her as a fragile outsider, but as a woman capable of standing her ground amidst the dust, sun, and chaos of the frontier. Still, her thoughts kept drifting to the man who had saved the boy, who had commanded respect from the town, and who had awakened something in her she could neither name nor resist. Luke Carson had become a fixture in her consciousness, and the realization of that presence both thrilled and terrified her. As Clara stepped out of the schoolhouse to collect her students for the morning lesson, she spotted him immediately. Luke Carson leaned against the post outside the sheriff's office, his hat casting a shadow over the sharp planes of his face, but his eyes found her instantly. There was no hurry in his approach, each step measured, deliberate, like a man who had mastered the art of patience. Yet with every movement he radiated an authority that spoke not only of law and survival, but of protection and silent understanding. Clara felt her pulse quicken. There was a tension between them now that had nothing to do with danger or the unpredictability of frontier life. It was something far more delicate, a fragile promise hovering just beyond reach. Before she could call the children together, a commotion erupted at the far end of the street. A wagon carrying supplies for the general store had tipped in a rut, spilling barrels and sacks into the road. The children scattered, some laughing nervously, some staring wide-eyed at the potential disaster. Without a thought, Clara rushed forward, instinct driving her to help, but before her hands could reach the nearest fallen barrel, strong, familiar arms steadied her, pulling her back slightly and guiding her away from harm. Luke Carson stood beside her, the reassuring weight of his presence anchoring her as the town sprang into motion. Together they helped secure the wagon, redirect the horses, and calm the scattered townsfolk. Through it all, Clara felt the stirring of something undeniable, a connection forged not in the quiet of safety, but in the shared navigation of chaos and challenge. Once the street had returned to its usual rhythm, Luke Carson finally allowed himself to step closer to Clara, his gray eyes locking with hers in a way that left her breathless. "You handled that well," he said, voice low, carrying that familiar mix of authority, warmth, and the faintest trace of admiration. Clara felt her cheeks flush under the intensity of his gaze. I tried," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The wind picked up, tossing her skirt and sending stray strands of hair across her face, and Luke reached out instinctively to brush them aside, his fingers lingering a fraction too long for mere propriety. In that moment, all pretense of caution dissolved. For a fleeting heartbeat, the dust, the heat, and the chaos of Silver Creek faded, leaving only the two of them, tethered by the unspoken understanding that had been growing since her first arrival. The subtle tension broke into something more tangible as he stepped even closer, the scent of leather and sun-warmed dust mingling with the faint sweetness of her hair and the crisp air of the morning. Clara's heart raced, a combination of fear, desire, and exhilaration she had never anticipated in a frontier town. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle now, yet threaded with that quiet insistence that always seemed to command attention. "You belong here, more than you know." She swallowed, struggling to reconcile the turmoil of her emotions. She had come west seeking purpose, safety, and a place to teach. Yet she had discovered far more. A man who could see her entirely, who understood the precariousness of her position and yet welcomed her strength. And in that realization, a warm, undeniable sense of belonging bloomed within her chest. Luke's hand found hers, steadying, affirming, and for the first time, Clara let herself surrender to the depth of the connection she had felt from their first meeting. There were no words for the electricity between them, no need for declarations. The language of shared glances, soft touches, and the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual admiration sufficed. The townsfolk moved around them, oblivious to the quiet intensity of the moment, and yet for Clara nothing else existed. The tension, the danger, the excitement of frontier life, all had led to this single, pivotal instant where fear and desire intertwined seamlessly. And when Luke leaned slightly closer, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear, Clara realized with a thrill that this man, steadfast, commanding, and unshakably present, was no longer merely a figure in her peripheral vision. He was her anchor, her protector, and in ways she could barely name, the beginning of a new life she had longed for without knowing it. By the time the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across Silver Creek, Clara and Luke stood side by side in the street, hands still lightly touching, hearts beating in tandem with the rhythm of the town. The children waved from the schoolhouse doorway, merchants continued their work, and the town exhaled into the evening, oblivious to the quiet promise that had been forged between teacher and sheriff. Clara allowed herself a small private smile, feeling the weight of the day lift as she embraced the certainty of her place here, in the town, in the schoolhouse, and beside the man who had stepped into her life with quiet authority and unwavering care. That evening, as Clara prepared for the night, she reflected on the tumultuous days since her arrival. The uncertainty, the tension, and the constant testing of her resolve had not broken her. Instead, it had strengthened her. She thought of Luke Carson, The man whose gaze had followed her across the dusty streets, whose hands had steadied her in moments of fear, whose presence had come to mean more than she dared acknowledge aloud. In the soft glow of her room, she realized that she was no longer the hesitant stranger from Boston. She was Clara Bennett of Silver Creek, a woman who had faced danger, carved a place for herself, and discovered in the process a heart capable of connection, trust, and love. And outside, the town settled into the quiet of evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, bathing the wooden buildings in a warm, forgiving glow. Luke Carson lingered on the street, watching over Silver Creek as he always did. Yet now, somewhere deep in the strength of his gray eyes, there was a softness reserved only for her. Clara felt it even from inside her small boarding house, a promise unspoken yet undeniable, that whatever storms the frontier might send their way, they would face them together. And in that shared understanding, the dust, the heat, and the uncertainty faded into the background, leaving only the steady certainty of connection, trust, and the beginnings of a love forged in the heart of the Old West. By the time she finally extinguished the candle and lay down beneath the patchwork quilt, Clara's thoughts were filled not with fear of the unknown, but with the quiet exhilaration of belonging to her students, to Silver Creek, and to the man whose presence had transformed the town from a place of mere survival into a world rich with possibility, promise, and a love that would grow stronger with every sunrise.